Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, mysterious voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I have found in my travels. Today, I want to talk about a book that I read. It's part of a booktube challenge between me and that hideous cretin over at the Bits of Lit, Lucas, or Dr. Strike the Sun, or the Brazen Bell, whatever he prefers to be called today. And we have chosen a book, if you remember my original challenge video, that is about, it's an adaptation of Frankenstein, and it's about the war in Iraq. I am referring to Frankenstein in Baghdad by Ahmed Saadawi, and this was published in 2013. For those who don't know, Ahmed Saadawi is a Iraqi author who has written a couple books, but this is his most recent book. But I did find out that he in my search he wants to publish some more, but I don't think he has published anything. He's also a cultural critic, and that shows up in a lot of his writings, cultural criticism of Iraq, of the issues that country and really the Middle Eastern region and Arabs in general that they face and they need to work on in order to become stronger in their country and stuff like that. But I had never heard of Ahmed Saadawi before reading this, but I am a fan afterwards because although there are some flaws in this book, I did ultimately like it, and I'll talk about why I liked it in the analysis section later. But yeah, I'm going to talk about this book. I'm going to make sure to talk about only to a certain point. In the summary section, I urge you to go out and read this if you haven't done so already. There's a couple elements that I don't want to spoil, but I will spoil some of it in the analysis section. I think that's unavoidable at this point. And then after you're finished watching this video, make sure to go check out Lucas from the Bits of Lit. He has a video as we are competing against one another to determine who has the better analysis, which is usually me, but he refuses to recognize that. But I'm always interested in hearing what his thoughts on the book are. And he might say, he was too distracted by the lockdown in Shanghai, or he was too hungry to focus on reading. But, those are all excuses. And to be honest, I hope everything's going well for him, and that the lockdown in Shanghai ends as soon as it can. But yeah, without further ado, let's talk about Frankenstein in Baghdad. Again, I will summarize to a certain point, do an analysis, and we will move on from there. So Frankenstein in Baghdad takes place, of course, in Baghdad from the perspective of multiple characters, and it's kind of put in the perspective of a committee report. So going to presumably the U.S. powers in Iraq, the U.S. military in Iraq. And in this committee report, it's also mentioned that an author gained confidential or classified information. So they have access to that, and that's presumably, it's even mentioned through the story, that's what this is, sort of like the classified report and the author mixing fiction or something together. But one of the characters that the story focuses on is Alishva, who is a widowed mother living alone in a poor rundown region of Baghdad known as the Jewish Ruin. And Alishva, she lost her son Daniel to the original war in Iraq around 1990, and she's frustrated with that. She frequently prays to Saint George, a patron saint who was ripped apart, torn apart, and then put back together by Jesus mythically. And she prays that St. George will bring her word about what happened to her son, because she doesn't know if he's dead or alive, and she kind of wants to know about that because it's been 30 years at this point. The story also focuses on Hadi. Hadi is a junk dealer living in the Jewish ruin. He's been collecting body parts, hoping to bring dignity to the dead by assembling them together in the form of a corpse, which he has called What's Its Name. which is an interesting name for the corpse. But he figures he's probably going to discard the corpse, because this is a way of him trying to make sense of the devastation in Iraq and the fact that the U.S. military doesn't seem to be doing a good job with all the chaos that's going on. But Hadi is passing by a hotel one day when a security guard named Hasid Jafar sees a suicide bomber coming towards the hotel and fires upon him. He manages to save the hotel from harm, but Hasid is killed in the process, and his soul is lifted out of his body, his spirit, or something like that. And in an effort to find a body and prevent him from not being able to move on to the afterlife, it enters into what's its name. And it begins going about controlling what's its name in some form or manner. Elisheva sees what's its name and believes him to be Daniel, and what's its name even hangs around her because they're bringing each other comfort, and maybe to some extent, Daniel's soul is one of the elements of what's its name. It's not really clear there. A bunch of mysterious deaths began happening with people began dying around the Jewish ruin, including people who were pretty angry about, and who might have been murderers themselves. And it's revealed that what's its name has been doing this. And a journalist named Mahmoud begins investigating this, asking questions about Hadi, and Hadi responds that it's none of his business. And he told some people about what's its name, but when Mahmoud asked, he's like, don't ask me any more questions. But eventually Mahmoud manages to get to him, and he gives a recorder to Hadi to give to what's its name, and what's its name talks about his motivation for bringing justice to to a noble crusade that he's doing to Baghdad, where there is no justice. And he's driven by the revenge of the body parts, like the people who have grudges, who are made of the various body parts that he has. And he confronts Hadi about this, and even says, you're on my list because Hasid Jafar believes that you're partially responsible for his death. And what's his name goes on this crusade and ends up joining a militia who have different aims. And as what's its name's body parts begin to fall off, they begin to replace it with other body parts, each with people who have different goals and grudges in mind. And eventually they start replacing him with criminal body parts, whereas before they were trying to go for innocence. And now it's criminal body parts, which don't have any moral quandaries with killing innocent people. And so he began just killing anyone and everyone in order to stay alive and finish his crusade, which grows ever larger. And he knows that as the longer he's living, the more he's going to want to kill. The police visit Hadi because they sense that he is somewhat responsible for these killings, and they pretty much beat him badly and take his stuff. Mahmoud, meanwhile, is struggling with his job, with trying to figure out how to get by in the field of journalism, and also dealing with some personal romantic issues, which it's kind of weird and it diverts from the story too much, in my opinion. But it does highlight some of the cultural issues in Iraq, which I was talking about earlier. Elisheva eventually leaves because her family tricks her into seeing another Daniel, even though it's her grandson. And she does end up leaving Iraq for Australia, which is what her family wanted her to do. And then the military circles around the Jewish ruin because they think that what's its name is in the ruin because they've been hunting him as well. And a suicide bomb goes off, which allows what's its name to escape. And from there, the rest of the story happens. I'll let you discover it as you read the story. But I do think the ending is very interesting. In terms of analysis, there is a fair bit to talk about with this interesting story, with this very fascinating adaptation of of Frankenstein, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. When I was reading it, I was constantly comparing it to the story Beauty by an author whose name I can't remember. I'll put it up here. But like Beauty was an adaptation of the Beauty and the Beast fairy tale, and I complained when I read it that it didn't do enough to distinguish itself from the story of Beauty and the Beast. That it wanted to be, it was just a straight retelling, not really trying to do anything different. But Frankenstein in Baghdad is very different from that in that it tells the story, it adapts the story of Frankenstein to the war in Iraq, and it does have a few problems here and there, but I think it's a wonderful adaptation. And so I think as we talk about that story, that element of whether or not this is good or not, we should consider that, and whether how much it tries to distinguish itself and make something of its own. But one of the themes that Ahmed Saadawi talks about in this story, one of the ideas that he plays around with is, what are the goals of What's Its Name? Because What's Its Name is animated, and it seems to have goals in mind, so much so that it's going about killing people. What does it want? It really says a couple things throughout the story. It wants justice for the people who were killed in suicide bombings or in various like cold-blooded murders or something like that, or revenge of some element, because What's Its Name kills the guy who sent Daniel, Alvisha's son, off to war in the first war in Iraq. And people didn't really mourn them. Like, even the family is like, don't investigate this any further, because it really seems like this was something that the guy had coming to some degree. Like, the people were so frustrated with him, and so really getting at the overall concern of like the culture at the time, of how even the original war in Iraq hasn't been like the issues and the feelings of anger that developed during that time maybe weren't addressed at this time. Which is an interesting idea that Ahmed Saadawi is playing with. But there is an interesting quote that I would like to read to you from this. "That's not everything," he said. "What's worse is that people have been giving me a bad reputation. They're accusing me of committing crimes, but what they don't understand is that I'm the only justice there is in this country," which is an interesting quote from What's Its Name, outlining that there's no sense of justice in this war-torn place anymore. That maybe there hasn't been justice for a while, as I just noted with the previous war in Iraq. And so it's really interesting that this being that was created wants to create this sense of justice, this sort of sense of equality and fairness, where something doesn't exist like that because Baghdad is a currently changing place. But as you may have heard me say in the summary section, that might not go so well, because as more body parts are being replaced on What's Its Name to keep What's Its Name going, it develops new vengeances, new grudges, and you can see that the longer you do that, that would create more and more of a problem, that this would become never-ending. Another quote, let me read to you. "My list of people to seek revenge on grew longer as my old body parts fell off, and my assistants added parts for my new victims, until one night I realized that under these circumstances, I would face an open-ended list of targets that would never end." And that's really a really fascinating thing for the monster to realize, because even though it knows that that's going to happen, it keeps replacing its body parts, partially because of the fear of death. Like, what happens to these souls, like these people who were meshed together once the monster dies? That who knows? And that's like a fear that's keeping him going, but also a desire for revenge that is ever growing. And who knows? The monster can't die, so maybe it just might end up keep killing people forever, and that's not a good thing. That's endless blood in the streets right there. And this all makes me think of, like, what does the monster represent in this story? Because in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, the monster represented like man's march towards science and our desire to supplant God or something like that, and the dangers of doing so, because we might end up creating a giant mistake that haunts us for the rest of our days. And what does this monster represent? One thing you could say is the tragedy of war, that in an effort to keep on to keep preventing like further death. You have to engage in death in order to end this war. Like the tragedy of war is that it's bloody and never ending, and that's exactly what the monster is. Like it's bloody, it's never ending. It's going to keep going until everyone on the list is dead in some sort of way. And that works if you consider the monster to be real, or if you consider the monster to be an imaginary thing in Hadi's mind, because it's kind of indicated that that's the case. Because Hadi confesses to doing this near the end of the story, and like it's assumed that maybe he's the one who did all these killings. And that's a tragedy of war, because the war in Baghdad was so extreme and so troublesome that it seriously affected Hadi. It saw him lose one of his friends and turn to killing other people in order to try to bring an end to this war, or try to send a message to the Americans. And Hadi, or the monster, are really victims of this war itself. But you could also see the monster as like America. That the monster comes in with noble goals in mind. America, like trying to find a sense of justice for what happened during 9/11, even though Iraq was not the place that caused 9/11. And ultimately, when Iraq, like when America like caught some of the people who were responsible for 9/11, like they changed their goals, and as the monster changed their goals, and they started hunting other people. And eventually, like, you lose track of what your original goals were, what your original purpose was. And that's what happens to the monster. Like, and that's what happened to America. They lost what their purpose was, and they stayed in Iraq for way too long, and they made the whole place worse off for what happened. Like, Baghdad became unrecognizable to what it was in the early 2000s, to what it was in the 80s, even before the first Iraq war. And I think that's really fascinating. I don't think that's quite what Ahmed Saadawi is getting at, but I do think there is an argument to be made there. As I've noted before, Ahmed Saadawi is a bit of a cultural critic, and I do think he does touch upon frustrations with the Iraqi government in this story. Characters are upset at both the Americans and the American-led new government of Iraq, and the police and the corruption. Hadi is beaten by the police, and they take his things. They're made out to be thugs. Like, who instituted these police officers? Probably the Americans. There's also a sense of corruption, which Mahmoud deals with. Like, his boss basically steals a lot of aid money, and he's left on the hook for that. And it's not good. And what I think is ultimately the source of this is the American intervention in Iraq, leading to so many of these problems. So it's partially a critique of the war in Iraq and putting the blame on Americans, but also it's a bit of cultural criticism because of the frustrations with the infighting in Iraq between Baaths and Sikhs, or the various parties like Shiites or something like that. I'm not as in tune of the partisan fights that go on in the country, but there's a lot of different infighting that has happened, and it's ultimately led to more bloodshed, more people being harmed, and a loss of control in the country. Like, people like Hadi, like they no longer feel like they have control over their own destiny, and so they're creating to bring a sense of justice to Iraq, to Baghdad, and that's not really going to happen. But does Hadi know that? Probably not. And so it's very fascinating that Ahmed Saadawi gets at a lot of these criticisms through the lens of like magical realism and science fiction. And like you can really get an understanding of at least partially like what people in Iraq might be thinking in this day and age, and you're like even right now, because this story was published about 10 years ago. At least the English translation was published around that time. So I do think the story is interesting to read from that perspective, because you can understand some of the issues that this culture might be facing. Another thing I really love about this story is the characterization, specifically of Hadi, how he is so frustrated and upset over the loss of a friend and really the loss of Baghdad that he turns to creating a monster of some sort, of collecting bodies in an effort to bring dignity to the dead, and ends up creating what's its name. And like you could argue that this is all in Hadi's head, or that this is like like this is actually real and happening. And then Hadi realizes that he's way over his head once he sees what's its name is doing. I like Elisheva, like how like she's so sad over the loss of her son, she's turning to Christianity, to Saint George and Jesus to get any word from her son. And she's so willing to believe that this monster is her son, even though she knows, like it says in the story, like she knows that's not his face. Like she just thinks this is Saint George trying to, bring a miracle about. And like it's not really her son, but it's a sign that maybe she should move on. And Mahmoud's also an interesting character, although like his story like kind of digresses at timing and seems to go nowhere. Like he's representative of some of the issues that people in Iraq face. Maybe he's a stand-in for Ahmed Saadawi himself. It does kind of seem like that at times. But I do think the characterization of those three characters, plus what's its name, like its crusade that it's going on, and how it knows that it's a pointless crusade, because the longer it lives, the more people are going to be killed, and some people might not deserve it. But it's still doing it because of a fear of dying itself, which I think is really a really interesting kind of spin on the Frankenstein story. And as I mentioned before, there's elements of magical realism. Like this entire story is magic realist kind of fantasy, and an interesting spin on the war in Iraq, influences of religion all the way around. And like I think you kind of saw that in the original Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And then a strong, sad tone that is peppered throughout this story, which I think it makes it like it's not quite gothic like Frankenstein was, but it is kind of sad to see what has become of Baghdad over time, and how the actions of what's its name in the American military are making the situation worse. But there are a number of problems. Like it feels like the story loses focus at times. It meanders all around. Mahmoud's story in particular, as I noted before, doesn't really seem to have a purpose or go anywhere. And I feel like they're Ahmed Saadawi is trying to tell two different stories, like the magic realist Frankenstein story, and a cultural criticism of Iraq. And maybe those could have been two different things, but here he tried to combine them, and so it makes the monster element feel kind of gimmicky, like you could have done without it, or you could have written some other story and tried to infuse that element to it. But it does feel pretty gimmicky and not like it could have gone in depth. Like I think what's its name is kind of a side story at times, and that's not what this story is called. It's not called Iraq is a very complicated place that needs to be addressed. It's called Frankenstein in Baghdad. So I do think if Ahmed Saadawi should have really focused on one issue over the other, perhaps. But it doesn't hurt to focus on criticisms, just more of a focus on one idea than meandering around at times. Anyway, those were my thoughts on Frankenstein in Baghdad by Ahmed Saadawi. A pretty good story. I really enjoyed reading it, and I feel like I am more richer for having experienced this story. I really like the adaptation of Frankenstein, and the things that Saadawi had to say are very important, especially 10 years after the fact of having written it. I don't know enough about Iraqi culture to see if any of this is being addressed, or even Arabian culture at large, the Middle East, to see if any of the problems are being addressed. Given that there's war between Saudi Arabia and Yemen, I would probably say maybe less so. But the fact that the United States is leaving those areas is kind of good, but maybe it's not. Maybe like leaving a vacuum is not a good thing in and of itself. But I do think this is worth checking out. Go find it, go read it. Let me know what you think in the comments below, or if you want to tell me what you thought of my review, let me know what you think. Let's have a discussion about Frankenstein in Baghdad. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about this author and this book, because I doubt a lot of people know about it. I didn't find out about it until just a couple months ago when I was looking for a book to challenge Lucas from The Bits of Lit. Also, don't forget to go check out his channel so that you can see what his thoughts are. We always have different thoughts on books. Like we sometimes agree, but we mostly like we pick different ideas to attack. And so I would love to see what he has to say about this. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and Frankensteinian travels. Farewell.